Uh, Good afternoon, uh, Ambassador, ladies and gentlemen. Ambassador Sultansky is no stranger to ISAS. He has spent time with us before. We've had very stimulating discussions during his previous seminar, broadly on the subject of the Ukraine. But before that, let me welcome all of you to yet another session of Ambassador's lecture series. This is something that is catching on a bit, and many of our friends are very enthusiastic about this program. We are very grateful to the diplomatic corps based in Singapore, who have also responded enthusiastically to these invitations. And within a week or so, we'll have yet another colleague of Ambassador Sultansky, Ambassador Green of Australia, who will be speaking to us on other issues. We all, those of us who have been following, and I'm sure all of us have been following the events in New York, know that yesterday was a very significant day in almost in the history of the United Nations. This was the largest ever gathering in the UNGA. And President Obama, when he spoke, he mentioned Ukraine at length, the Ukraine, and immediately thereafter, not immediately thereafter, a little thereafter, Mr. Putin also spoke. Several speakers down the line. Usually the first speaker, I think, is the Brazilian, and then is the American. That is the norm. That is the norm in the GA, but eventually all the main speakers get to speak on the first day. Anyway, so on the Ukraine, basically Obama urged calm, etc., and there was a response. We will hear more of it from the ambassador, perhaps, if you'll.
I did not promise you.
Okay, that is all right. But nonetheless, we know that this is a very, very significant issue which has ramifications for all of us. And interestingly, there have been other events in Europe in recent times. Spain, for instance, in Catalonia, Basque region, etc. So there are certain tendencies which are both vociferous and at the same time, coming together of European countries. On the one hand, countries are seceding. On the other hand, they are wanting to come together within the framework of the European Union. So that is very interesting developments. But I shan't steal the speaker's thunder, of course. I'll let him speak for himself and speak to the subject. The subject would be Ukraine. What is the technical title of the talk is "The World Will Benefit from Ukraine's Success and Vice Versa." And to speak to it, might I invite Ambassador Sultansky. Ambassador.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, distinguished scholars, friends of Ukraine, ladies and gentlemen. I'm thankful for your time you decided to spare for my intervention here in the Institute of South Asia Studies, which is, according to Dr. Chaudhary, is the second time invited me for such gathering. I would like to acknowledge that with some high remarks on your side, I have nothing to do but to speak even more responsibly before this respectful audience. So if I stay some more time in Singapore, and today is exactly 5 years of my tenure in this wonderful country, I will have some more opportunities to be invited to ISAS.
I'm sure.
Just a few words about my decision to put this name. The world will benefit from Ukraine's success and vice versa. To say the truth, several people asked me, what did you mean? And I even hesitated whether to change it or not. But to my understanding, what is said here, that if Ukraine managed to cope the problems, the challenges which it is facing now, every part, every corner, or every entity in the world may benefit from this. And if Ukraine fails, very complicated consequences could come. So this is about benefit and the opposite side of the story. Well, I would prefer to tell you some thoughts of mine, and I invite you to comment, to put questions, or to disagree with me afterwards. So let's make this meeting sort of a round table discussion rather than lecture of distinguished guests. Let me begin with a simple question generated by the theme of my lecture. Is there something actual for Singaporeans and those living in other regional states from what is happening to, in, and around Ukraine? I suggest recalling this question again in the end of discussion and appreciate your conclusions rather than mine, if it is, of course, inspiring for you. Quarter of the century after disintegration of the Soviet Union, all of us have become involuntary witnesses of the further decay of the remnants of the former empire, wrongly called Russia. I stress on that because Moscovia or Muscovy is its original name. This entity had been known as Moscovia since Mongol-Tatar invasion of the 13th century. At those times, a cognominal ulus or province with a settlement Moskva as a center was established to improve tax collection. In 18th century, Emperor Peter I, sometimes known as Peter the Great, of German Denmark descendant, by means of manipulation, changed Moscovia for Russia. I will draw attention once again that not Russia, but Russia, O after R. It's quite meaningful for better understanding what country we are talking about. This has been done in order to furnish the compromising, from his point of view, true history of Moscovia, which was treated as a stranger in Europe, with far more rich historically and entirely European record of its peaceful southwestern neighbor. Large part of its population then belonged to various but Slavic ethnicities speaking different languages and dialects. By means of forgery and ducal house of the Schleswig-Holstein Gottorps that had been invited to rule the least attractive entity in the frontiers of the medieval Europe, restyled Moscovia. In this way, European hypocrisy married Asian despotism. Strictly speaking, Rus, or Kiev Rus, was the name of the big in size and an influential early medieval state with Kiev as a capital. That state had thrived for centuries when Moscovia did not exist in any form. It was established late 12th century as a small fortress, and 100 years later, following the demand of the treasury of Golden Horde, was recognized an ulus, or province of Golden Horde. As I said before, for the sake of better collection of taxes. Tiny, nonetheless, assertive Golden Horde's province learned a lot of worst from its Mongol Tatar parents. Ages after, under the Romanovs dynasty or communist reign, it seems to do the same with European heritage. Borrowed wording, wrapping, and in the end made ugliest of everything. Until nowadays, once Ulus expanded many times in size, consistently implementing cruel and offensive policy both externally and internally. Each neighbor of Moscovia either fall victims of imperialistic encroachments or kept prepared for incursions of the muscles playing power. Mostly through force of arms, Moscovia Russia imposed its domination over other peoples, thus gradually becoming multi-ethnic at the expense of repeatedly attached territories. We used to think of empires as of the states or powers which have colonies somewhere overseas. It's normal perception, normal understanding. In case of Moscovia, the territories were occupied on the mainland. Simultaneously, while transforming from a young and ambitious Ulus into mainland empire, Moscovia Russia has always been a melting pot for peoples less resilient to the assertions of Kremlin chieftains. Whether they were dukes, tsars, emperors, secretary generals, or presidents like present days. On the eve of the First World War, Russia was righteously recognized the largest by size empire. Lenin accused Russia of those times of being a prison of the people. Actually, Bolsheviks' regime, which he created, was even uglier version of Tsarist reign, with millions exterminated in 1920s and 30s, including by means of genocide Holodomor in Ukraine in 1932-33, when from 5 to 7 million Ukrainians were simply exterminated with hunger. In the Bolsheviks invented concentration camps, it is a big mistake that it was Nazi Germany to which this invention belongs. It was done, it was established in 20s by Bolsheviks for kulaks or farmers, just simply farmers, who were considered too rich to be equal to proletarians. The Gulag deployed all over the Soviet Empire. Gulag, I doubt whether everybody knows what's that. Gulag was a system of the concentration camps scattered around the Soviet Union, so-called labor camps, with the most terrible conditions for those who fall victims of the Bolshevik regime. Millions of people, of course, majority completely innocent people, were exterminated in Gulag. One can stubbornly point at the United States, reproducing conspiracy according which in 1991 Washington intentionally undermined good and almost innocent Soviet Union to become the unique superpower and endlessly skip coupons of such position. Well, in 1983, the last year student of the Moscow University, I had a pleasure to listen repeatedly to our lecturer, who was then Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Soviet Union. He, once a week, he came to our group and told us so-called specified information. Once he came to the audience, and one should see and hear how undiplomatically he commented Ronald Reagan's definition of the then Soviet Union, the evil empire. It was first pronounced exactly in 1983. As a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, 14 former Soviet republics gained independence. Only Russia contracted phantom disease as if deprived of ownership. Just simply look at the map, and it is becoming obvious that every entity of the former Soviet Union, the so-called Soviet Socialist Republics, they were liberated from Moscow control. More or less liberated, it depends. Now, 25 years after, we may say that some countries are even more subordinate to Moscow than they used to be in the Soviet era. Others, like Baltic countries, are a member of EU, member of NATO, and they have absolutely different style and way of life. And countries like Ukraine and Georgia are still fighting for the true independence and sovereignty. And there are countries which are very much subordinate to the Kremlin policy, like our immediate neighbor Belarus or Armenia, the tiny country in the Caucasus. Not to mention countries like Moldova, part of which is still under control of a Russian army, or Georgia, which lost 20% of its territory after 2 annexations of Abkhazia in early 90s and South Ossetia 7 years ago. Until recently, most of Russians, correctly, Russians, not Russians, Russians, if asked about Ukrainians as of different nation, insisted, "We are one." Due to historical reasons and relevant instincts, Ukrainians have always been much less enthusiastic about such kind of unanimity and brotherhood particularly. One may ask why. This is a subject for a separate lecture. The way Moscovia Russia developed its capacity and implemented its intentions was repeatedly examined, studied, and explained. Quite often, such researches were heavily affected by Russian propaganda. Those of you who are skeptical about Zbigniew Brzezinski, born in Warsaw and allegedly, that's why mentally confronting Russia, are advised to get acquainted with writings by George Kennan, U.S. ambassador once to the USSR and co-author of the Cold War Basic Principles. I draw your attention to his article, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, distinctively depicting contemporary Russia, though written almost 70 years ago. Distinguished scholars, you cannot imagine how impressed I was when I looked through this article. Firstly, I decided I was wrong. It was written just yesterday, day before yesterday, but not 70 years ago. Every characteristic of then society in 1946-47 was absolutely applicable to nowadays. Overwhelming majority of us are naturally focused at the future. Russians look backwards at the past. If you want to understand motivation of Russia's going on, think retrospectively. The most popular slogans of today Russia are, our grandfathers fought, means they gained victory in the Second World War, which they never say it is Second World War, but Great Patriotic War. Present-day Russia does not recognize that the Second World War was cooked, was baked, was prepared by two sides, by Soviet Union and Germany. Germany was defeated, and Bolshevik regime, or communist regime in Soviet Union, was not punished but only appreciated afterwards. This is a trick of the fate, a problem which haunt Moscow since the completion of the Second World War. Absence of punishment of the communist regime.
Because they also invaded Poland at the same time as Russia, as Germany.
They invaded Poland. They invaded a part of Romania. They organized, but failed, campaign against Finland, a big part of which was named Komi Autonomous Republic and still exists as a part of the Russian Federation. One of the most backward, poorest province of present-day Russia. Speaking almost same language, almost same Finnish language, with same traditions, with same songs, with same mentality, but under the reign of Kremlin, experience the worst possible life as of today. One of Ukraine's Ukraine's eternal problem is 2,063 kilometers of common border with Russia. Every internal pathology of Russia instantly leaks in my country. On the opposite side, 1,241 kilometers of Ukraine borders with NATO member states, sort of counterbalancing Russia's appetites, although at much more moderate proportion than many of us Ukrainians would like to observe. Ongoing agony of the colossus on the feet of clay poses grave danger to the numerous entities inside Russia, and so unfortunately to its neighbors, and far, far wider. This is not the first case when Moscovia attests resilience of Ukraine. Ukraine has been defending its sovereignty and territorial integrity from the ongoing Moscovia incursion since February 2014. The former president Yanukovych and his cronies had dramatically weakened the country by that time. This is one of more theme for a dispute, but once again, it is another conversation. Very reasonably, Kremlin's chieftains failed to envisage Ukrainians' ability to resist invasion. They also failed to foresee how unambiguously the civilized world condemned Russian aggression against Ukraine and annexation of Ukrainian Crimea in particular. By the way, I'm happy to say that here in Singapore, on the 5th of March 2014, I attended the parliamentary sitting where now already former Minister of Foreign Affairs K. Shanmugam delivered a speech in which he made an unambiguous statement of condemnation of the government of Singapore, the illegal annexation of Crimean Peninsula by Russian armed forces. The people and politicians of Ukraine, except for the pro-Russian fifth column, united in front of another attempt of Russia to hinder Ukraine's return to the common European family. I must say that at the very first days of Ukrainian independence, the return to the European family values hemisphere was identified as the strategic goal of the nation. And year after year, Moscow signaled it is a movement in the wrong direction. You should not look to the Brussels and EU capitals. It is better to establish Eurasian Union because we are exclusive. We means Russians. We are exclusive. We have different values. We established the special civilization named Ruski Mir, or Russian world. Some kind of mixture of Orthodox religion and some fabulous story about unrepeatable Russian soul. From Ukraine's perspective, political, economic, and security environment worldwide is not propitious for such endeavor. U.S. enters. Excuse me. As far as after yesterday's speeches in the United Nations, I sort of reprocessed my lecture. Now I would rather shift from this short sketch of Moscovia-Russia history and beginning of Ukrainian fight for independence one more time. I would speak some words on the international environment which we are facing today. And firstly, and understandably, I would mention the United States, which enters presidential competition. Yesterday, some of us, had an opportunity to listen to the Nobel Prize U.S. President, Barack Obama. In his yesterday address at the United Nations, he warned against destructive behavior fraught of disastrous consequences. Well, I don't mean to analyze all his speech, but what was very meaningful for me, that two points were emphasized: responsibility and respect towards others. Responsibility of big powers, responsibility of politicians, of leaders, and respect for the choice of big or small peoples, of males and females, respect for the aspirations to live in the peaceful world. I was pleased to hear that Ukraine was among the key issues in his speech. For almost 3 minutes, he delivered his thoughts related to Ukraine and the situation in which Ukraine is presently because of the Russian aggression unleashed against my country. He mentioned Ukraine even ahead of Islamic states and the rest of urgent global questions. By the way, the pleasant remark on Singapore was nice to hear as well. As you remember, he mentioned 3 countries: Singapore, Senegal, and
Singapore, Senegal, and Colombia.
It's very, very unusual composition of countries. But
one from each continent. That was the idea.
Yes. This was, and what was really meaningful as for me that these countries were mentioned because of the of big capacity which country assume when government and people move in the same direction. Well, allow me an anecdote, if you don't mind, of course. A Russian delegation to the United Nations, it is a very fresh one, I doubt whether you heard it. Russian delegation to the United Nations General Assembly was asked about its official position on some matter. A representative person answered, "It would be made public after Americans promulgate their position." When asked why so, he answered, or she answered, doesn't matter, to make an opposite statement. Well, European Union, it is still overcoming economic and financial hardships, aggravated by the migrants' inflow from the Middle East and North Africa. As of today, 473,000 migrants and 120 have been agreed for distribution by the EU countries, member states. As you know, maybe 3 more times bigger number of migrants are expected in Europe within coming months. The war unleashed by Kremlin against Ukraine on one hand and migrant crisis on the other complicates in united Europe recovery from economic and financial crisis. Noteworthy that Russians don't migrate to North Korea or some Moscow-friendly African or Latin American countries and settle themselves in Spain, in Great Britain, in Cyprus, most of all, or some other pleasant places in European Union. China's growth is being slowed down with an impact over the entire globe. Well, it is commonplace. But does it have an impact on Ukraine? Yes, unfortunately. Ukraine significantly counts for Chinese investments. Export-wise, Beijing is an important trading partner of Ukraine. The country is becoming our biggest agriculture products importer. Amidst Russia's declining position as one of our biggest customers, the export of Ukrainian grain triplicated within a year. By the way, altogether, this year Ukraine will export almost 36 million tons of grain. It is 2/3 of our annual harvest, which, according to the very credible calculations, may reach 100 million tons. Islamic State sets up new cause and threat from Syria to dozens of countries across the planet, Southeast Asia inclusive. In Ukraine, there is an indigenous minority of Crimean origin, Karemli, better known as Crimean Tatars. Almost all of them are truly moderate Muslims. They reject extremism in any form. But under occupation regime, they might be radicalized, being persecuted, abducted, tortured, and even killed. In 1944, just as soon as Crimean Peninsula was liberated from Nazi army, the entire Crimean Tatar population was deported to the Central Asia. 1/3 of almost 200,000 population of Crimean Tatars died within days and weeks as a result of this deportation. It was Stalin policy. These people was accused of collaborating with Germans, and on this pretext deprived of their motherland. The story is quite complicated. Until the 18th century, Moscow paid tribute to Crimean Khan. It was not big, but very powerful country. Territorially, it was Crimean Peninsula. 2.5 centuries later, Moscow paid off for this humiliation. Now this people is persecuted, and what is very important, almost all of them are truly moderate Muslims. India has become an opportunity for us, but unfortunately not immediate one. Ukraine has always been eager to develop comprehensive cooperation with this important power. Nonetheless, we repeatedly stumbled over pro-Moscow lobby in Delhi, whether we negotiated ordinary transactions or defense-related matters. By the way, if I told you one anecdote, I afford myself another one. Mr. Putin lecture in New York hours ago reminds me with one joke. The year 2015, Kim Jong-il and Putin hold G2 summit. I understand we do not circulate my speech.
No.
Yeah?
No.
Okay. Thank you for understanding.
Otherwise, Kim Jong-il will be very angry.
Happy or angry? There is even maybe better joke. Russian peacekeepers. Terrible joke. Vulnerability and or remoteness of other regions from Ukraine can't be undervalued in Ukraine's realities. Let me say some words on the Ruski Mir ideology, which I mentioned already once. In fact, this is truly a Goebbels-style propaganda, which Kremlin very successfully introduced worldwide. It is unimaginable that millions of people in Russia had consented to their country's aggression that deprived another so-called brotherhood nation, I mean Ukraine. Ukraine is always named a brotherhood nation, brotherhood people, from the sovereign right to choose its own way of life. Well, if I said about brothers, of course, all other nations around Russia are junior brothers. Don't be mistaken. Does this type of assertiveness extend beyond Russia's neighboring countries? My answer is yes. Are there any implications of the Russian world for relations between smaller and bigger nations in Asia? Yes, I would say plenty of. What do you think of the most consumed product in Russia? Vodka. You're wrong. The number
Good try.
I have, yeah, good knowledge. The number of Kremlin propaganda consumers is many times bigger. And this doesn't refer only for the internal consumers, but worldwide. I must say that even here in Singapore, I came across with some publications. Although this country is truly friendly towards Ukraine, and the visit of K. Shanmugam to Kiev last May once more proved my words. But even here in Singapore, just a few weeks ago, I came across with a definition: civil war in Ukraine. Civil war in Ukraine. Of course, I had nothing but to write my letter to the editor-in-chief and ask him to explain what kind of civil war he or his staff find in my country. The answer was quite polite and reasonable, and he explained that some junior correspondents they don't care much about wording and sometimes are mistaken, etc., etc. So we exhausted this conflict, and he wrote me the letter of apology. So everything is more or less settled. But somewhere in the back of the mind of many people, whatever is pronounced by Russia propaganda machine is taken for granted, is taken without hesitations, because it is repeated so many times that even ugliest, most twisted lie, sooner or later, according to the big teacher Goebbels, is consumed and is taken for granted. In fact, Moscow strives to replace the power of rule with the rule of power, posing a grave threat to our small world, where Ukraine stands at the forefront. Remember the MH17 tragedy. It highlights outrageous nature of Moscovian Russia, which remains unchanged through ages. Importantly, MH17 tragedy leaves no doubts of who committed the crime. Miraculously, there were no Singaporeans on board. As you know, countries concerned are going to establish international tribunal to try those responsible. If I'm not mistaken, the special gathering on the sidelines of United Nations General Assembly is to take place today or tomorrow. You remember, probably a month ago, Russia vetoed the establishment of this tribunal, in spite of the fact that, well, even China was abstention.
Yeah.
At this point, it is quite controversial from my side to tell you an anecdote. Yeah? Allow me. So, the conversation as follows. Did you shoot down the plane? No. Was it your plane? No. Was it downed on your territory? No. Let us establish tribunal. No. But why? You are Russophobe. That's it. This is an exhaustive explanation of the approaches of Russian side towards this tragedy, which deprived the life of 298 people, innocent people, just a team on board, and more than 70 children. A group of scientists. Contrary to the circumstances, the Ukrainian nation stands on the right track. Significant reforms in every sphere are being implemented. Army has become strong enough to fight with northeastern horde and its proxies. Even export is being successfully redirected to other than the Russian market. It was 1/3 of Ukrainian export which was directed to Russia. Now the percentage substantially declined. International support of Ukraine has become a matter of reality. Noteworthy is growing support for Ukraine from NATO. The recent Ukrainian 2015 exercise was jointly run by NATO's Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response Coordination Center and the State Emergency Service of Ukraine. More than 1,000 people from 34 countries took part. You see, on the Ukrainian territory we have a number of very sensitive, very disaster disaster prone, but vulnerable, vulnerable enterprises. And such exercises turned out to be very timely for Ukraine. We have all of us have had, remember at least, Chernobyl disaster, man-made one. We don't want to have one more man-made. NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg visited Ukraine some days ago and noted in particular, today the Ukrainian people are facing their greatest challenge. There is conflict on Ukrainian soil. Russia has illegally annexed Crimea, an act we will never accept. And Russia continues to support the separatist forces in the east with weapons, command and control, and troops. According to intelligence, around from 8 to 9,000 of Russian soldiers and officers are deployed in the eastern Ukraine. And on Crimean Peninsula, around 30,000. Russia continues to support the separatist forces in the, and this is a violation of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, and it undermines the international rules-based order. In these difficult times, Ukraine can rely on NATO. NATO provides Ukraine with political and practical support, helps to defend independence and territorial integrity. NATO membership used to be unpopular in Ukraine until Russia unleashed war. What we see now? 60% favor Ukraine's NATO accession. It used to be 15, from 15 to 20, year by year. Now 60. Some words on domestic agenda. In Ukraine's newest history, there is an event which not many know or have already forgotten, even in Ukraine. That is a former government passing the so-called Black Thursday laws, draconian provisions of which denied the right to peaceful protest and freedom of speech. Ukraine has come an enormous distance since then, through revolution of dignity, through Maidan uprising, in order to meet its people's aspiration to advance badly needed reforms despite occupied Crimea and ongoing hybrid war waged by Russia in eastern Ukraine. In 2014, Ukraine held free and fair presidential and parliamentary election, concluded association agreement with the European Union. And this October, in 3 weeks, we'll have our local election. The list of tasks is really huge. From liberating occupied territories to make English the second language of Ukrainian public servants. Presidential administration will be the first state agency whose staff will have to speak fluent English. This demand will become mandatory since 2017. Just one more story. It was not recorded anywhere, but I witnessed the conversation of Lee Kuan Yew, who visited Ukraine in September 2010. Our then very poorly speaking Ukrainian Prime Minister insisted that Lee Kuan Yew answer his question whether Russian language should be the second state language. Those who are familiar with gesture of Lee Kuan Yew may recognize him. Stop, stop, stop. I am not familiar to your problems with languages, but what I know for sure, the second language in Ukraine must be English. I believe I quote him literally. Independence of the judiciary, fighting corruption, elevating of minimal salaries and pensions, administrative reform, harmonization of national legislation to the EU rules and norms, acquis communautaire, armed forces approximation to the NATO standards, and many more are just a part of the present Ukrainian agenda. I would say nothing is eternal. That's one more common point. But one thing is more durable than other, like water filters, for example. Not so many nations have been able to reinvent themselves, to avoid decline and keep developing. Likewise, water filters. Some of them are designed for short-time application. Others are made up of much better substances and can be cleaned and afterwards operate much longer. Ukraine is rebranding and renovating itself, challenging but thankful experience. Well, thanks to you for your watching my time. What I would like to say to the conclusion. Allow me to quote once again Mr. Lee Kuan Yew. And if someone can tell me when it was pronounced, I would be surprised. We either believe in democracy or we not. If we do, then we must say categorically, without qualification, that no restraint from any democratic processes other than by the ordinary law of the land should be allowed. If you believe in democracy, you must believe in it unconditionally. If you believe that men should be free, then they should have the right of free association, of free speech, of free publication. Then no law should permit those democratic processes to be set at naught. Well, this is really puzzle cross. It was 1955.
Thank you.
Well, colleagues, do you remember my suggestion to share you viewpoints on the lessons which can be learned from today's Ukraine? I insist. Ukraine's success will defeat criminal, pariah regimes. Ukraine's failure will invigorate apologists of the law of the jungle in international relations. If you think differently, let's try to find common points. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.